All right, we're here live in Las Vegas. The Mandalay Bay is behind us, and by now you probably knew what the Mandalay Bay was before, but now it is, of course, the site for the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history. And we're learning more about this shooting being different than others, and there are more ways as time goes on. Yes, the headline is that there are more people who lost their lives than ever before. There are more injured than we've ever seen before. But there is also more ammunition and more weaponry than we've ever seen before. To this point, the police have identified a cache of about 42 weapons. The assumption that, well, that must have been illegal. It's not illegal to amass weapons. It's about how it's done and over time. Now, that last component, time, really is a thread in understanding this particular murderer. This was not about a snap decision. This was not about somebody just in the moment losing it. No, this was planned for days, weeks, months. We now have pictures of our first looks inside the rooms that are over my shoulder, these two windows that are blown out. But what about inside those windows? This is the carpet, obviously, the room. These are the weapons. Now, these are relevant for two things. One, we see the kind of weaponry that was involved, and also to answer one of the points of curiosity about, well, how did he get all these guns in there? You know, he was moving them for days. These are not huge pieces of equipment. They're just very, very powerful, especially when modified the way this man, we believe, modified them. We believe it even more now, looking at these two particular weapons on the ground. We know that the number of weapons, that there were platforms, they were positioned, and what resulted was also this kind of plot to just rain bullets down on these thousands of people below. Everyone who tells the story of this uncharacteristic wave of gunfire, the kind of which I've never heard or seen in this country before. It's something that usually is just about the poorly trained on battlefields a half a world away. But this man brought that type of pain, that type of evil to bear right behind us. And that is one little clue into how he did this. Bigger mystery is into why he did it, but we're still just starting to understand, and we want to bring in senior correspondent Tom Foreman for this, our understanding of what actually happened that night. We've had so many different people talk to us about it, Tom, you know, and you're not going to have complete consistency on the little points, on the timing, on the timeline. The local officials haven't even put one out yet. And that's going to make a difference to the investigation. It's also a really helpful way for us to understand what these people endured, because another unique characteristic of this particular mass murder is duration. This wasn't one guy running through one clip, one moment. It took a long time, Tom, and you're doing the hard work of having us understand that duration and where our gaps in understanding remain to be at this point. What can you tell us?
Well, sure, Chris. The truth is many of these events do happen in a very short period of time. This was not the case here. If you look at when the shooting began here, 10:08 p.m., that was the first step here. That's when the windows were smashed out up here. The place behind you showed a moment before. That's when these shots started raining down here some 400, 500 yards onto the concert area down in here. And yes, because the type of weapons he was using, he was simply sort of sweeping the area with gunfire here because there was a mass of people gathered here, and that was an effective way to hit a lot of people in that area. And we saw that in the video of people reacting, where they couldn't really tell where everything was happening. This is one of the reasons why this went on so long. He was shooting from an unexpected location. Many people do not think to look up when this sort of thing happens. They tend to look around them, and many eyewitnesses said they did that here. So even though the shooting was coming in here, as panic set in out here, people did not know really to look there, and he was somewhat barricaded there. So let's go back to that time there, 10:08 p.m. We know there were almost immediately emergency calls to the police. By the time the police figured out that it was actually at the hotel and made their way over there, it was somewhere around 10:20 to 10:24. This gets really murky here because we don't know the details. We know that the police were working their way up through floors of the hotel based on what they were told by witnesses outside and people inside, trying to narrow it down and figure out where it was. And they did locate the room sometime around 10:24. And then a little bit after that, we don't know precisely when, they tried to make their first attempt to get into the room. So we've left that blank, but sometime between 10:25 and 10:30, it looks like. And what happened when they tried to do that? Well, they said They approached the room. They received gunfire. One of the officers was actually hit. They backed off, and SWAT responded. But I want you to remember this time, this 10:20 to 10:24. Remember, it started at 10:08. We're now up to 10:20, 10:24, somewhere in here. Remember that time as we move forward. After that first attempt was repulsed, after they were pushed back, then the SWAT team was called in. And by 11:20, the SWAT team was blowing the door to that room. They're blowing the door. 11:20. Remember what we were talking about a little while ago. We were talking about 10:20, 10:24, 10:30 maybe when the first attempt. This is much, much, much later. In fact, it is so much later, then they go inside and find out that the suspect, in fact, is dead inside the room. So if you look at the overall timeline, from the first shooting to the time that they know that the suspect is dead, huge amount of time, 10:08 to 11:20, 1 hour and 12 minutes. But even as people will scrutinize the police response, because that's what people always do after something like this, it is important to bear in mind, when they located that room and started putting pressure on the room and he started shooting back at him, by almost all accounts, his shooting out the window stopped at that point. So yes, 10 to 15 minutes of shooting out that window is a horrendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of gunfire rained down on people in that amount of time. But that would suggest that really this is sort of the active part of him being a shooter aiming at people outside. And because of the law enforcement response, it would appear that this other hour we're talking about here, we're not sure if he was already dead in the room at that point, if he'd already taken his own life, but we know for most of that time he was no longer shooting out the window. So this undeniably terrible thing, Chris, to have that amount of gunfire being rained down there from weapons like this, which can empty a clip in 7-10 seconds, putting 30 shots down at a pop, and then more if you have a bigger clip, even more. So that gives you an idea of the time, and we'll get more refinement as we move forward. Chris?
Well, that is very helpful, Tom, and it's also instructive to remind people this is a murderer who did everything he could to make sure that there was as much pain and bullets flying as possible. So any window that the first responders were able to create where that wasn't happening was a gift in this situation. And to a man so far, every expert we've asked who've done this work themselves say this time should not be seen as a delay by the authorities. Dealing with that mass of humanity, all the multiple reports that were wrong, and for those speculating online that there were other shooters, that's just false. There's no proof of it. And it's the kind of speculation that leads to an ugliness that nobody needs right now. Everybody involved with this investigation says they got the guy, but they were hearing multiple reports. They had to get up there, and then he had the equivalent of an arsenal on the other side of that door. Persevered and waited to have their numbers, and they went in. And Brooke, a situation that with unknown is always a breeding ground for agendas and ugliness and toxicity. And yes, we've seen great respect for the people who survived this. But just like time was a factor that night, time is a factor in getting a solid reckoning going forward. And you're going to hear about people who are exaggerating what we know. And that's why what Tom just laid out for us, the known and unknown, very important for people to know, because they're going to hear a lot of stuff that's just not true.
So we're going to come back to Las Vegas in a second.